There is a pattern many people struggle to understand. Someone comes into your life, you share something deep, something real, something that feels almost destined, and then suddenly they pull away. They disappear emotionally. They become distant, cold, confused. And you are left wondering, if the connection was real, why did they run? But here is the truth most people never talk about. When someone with avoidant tendencies encounters a deeply empathetic soul, something powerful happens inside them, something they are not prepared for. You see, people who avoid intimacy often live behind emotional walls they built long before you ever arrived. Those walls were not created because they do not feel. In fact, the opposite is often true. They feel deeply, but somewhere along the way, they learned that closeness could lead to pain, rejection, or loss of control. So they mastered distance, they mastered independence. They convinced themselves they did not need anyone. But then an empath walks into their life. An empath does something that disrupts their entire emotional system. An empath listens in a way others never have. They understand emotions that were never spoken out loud. They create a space where someone feels seen without being judged. And suddenly, the avoidant feels something unfamiliar. Safety. For many avoidant personalities, this level of emotional closeness is both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Because the moment they begin to feel safe, they also begin to feel vulnerable. And vulnerability is the one place they have spent their entire life avoiding. So when the connection deepens, something inside them begins to panic. Not because the relationship is wrong, but because it is too right. It is too real. It threatens the emotional independence they have relied on to survive. And so they run, not always physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes subtly, sometimes through silence, sometimes through excuses, but distance becomes their protection. And when that happens, the empath often feels rejected. They begin asking themselves painful questions. Was I too much? Did I care too deeply? Did I scare them away? But here is the powerful truth you must understand. You did not scare them away because you were too loving. You scared them because your love exposed something inside them they could no longer ignore. When an empath connects with someone, they often see past the surface. They sense the fears behind the silence. They notice the wounds behind the strength. And for someone who has spent their entire life hiding those parts of themselves, being seen that clearly can feel overwhelming. But something else happens that is even more powerful. Even when avoidants leave, the connection does not leave them, because emotional experiences that feel authentic create something psychologists call emotional imprinting. It is the reason certain people stay in our minds long after they are gone. And the empath leaves a deep imprint. Why? Because the empath offered something rare: presence without pressure, understanding without control, and compassion without conditions. Most people in the world interact on the surface. Conversations are safe, guarded, predictable, but with an empath, the avoidant experience depth. They experience someone who listened beyond the words, someone who understood emotions they themselves struggle to explain. And once someone has felt that level of connection, it becomes very difficult to replace. That is why distance often changes the avoidant's perspective. When they step away, they expect to feel relief, they expect freedom. They expect their independence to return. But something strange begins to happen. They start remembering the conversations, the moments of emotional safety, the calm presence the empath brought into their life. And they begin to realize that what they ran from was not a problem. It was actually a gift. The truth is, avoidants often run from love, not because it is wrong, but because it requires emotional courage they have not yet developed. And when time creates distance, they start to see things with clarity they could not see in the moment. They begin to miss the person who understood them without forcing them. They miss the emotional peace that came from being around someone who genuinely cared. And suddenly the walls that once protected them begin to feel lonely. This is why many avoidants return. Not because they suddenly changed overnight, but because the empath represented something they cannot easily recreate with anyone else. An emotional home. But here is the deeper lesson for the empath listening to this. Your purpose was never to chase someone who is running. Your purpose is to remain grounded in your value. When you are an empath, your greatest strength is your ability to love deeply without losing your self-respect. You do not beg for presence. You do not force connection. You do not shrink your heart just to make someone comfortable. Instead, you stand in your truth. Because real love is not something you have to convince someone to choose. Real love is something they recognize once they understand its value. And when someone truly experiences the depth of an empath's heart, that experience stays with them. Even if they run, even if they disappear, even if time passes. Because genuine connection has a way of echoing through someone's life long after the moment itself has ended. And that is the quiet power of the empath. They may not chase, they may not demand, but the presence they bring into someone's life is something that cannot easily be forgotten. When an avoidant personality encounters an empath, something unusual begins to happen inside them. For much of their life, avoidants have learned to keep relationships at a safe emotional distance. They may enjoy companionship, conversation, and even affection, but they are careful not to let anyone come too close to the parts of themselves they have learned to protect. Their independence becomes their armor. Their emotional space becomes their refuge. On the outside, they may appear calm, confident, and self-sufficient, but beneath that surface is often someone who has simply trained themselves to survive without relying too deeply on others. Then the empath enters their life, and the dynamic changes in ways they did not expect. An empath has a unique ability to create emotional depth in a connection. They listen differently. They observe the unspoken feelings behind someone's words. They pay attention to subtle emotional shifts that most people overlook. Instead of interacting on a superficial level, the empath naturally moves toward understanding another person's inner world. They ask thoughtful questions. They offer compassion without judgment. They create a space where someone can feel safe being their authentic self. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this experience can feel both comforting and unfamiliar. Many avoidants have gone through life without truly feeling understood. People may have known their personality, their habits, or their achievements, but very few have ever seen the deeper layers of their emotional experience. The empath, however, begins to recognize those layers almost instinctively. When this happens, the avoidant may initially feel a sense of relief. There is something profoundly calming about being around someone who does not demand perfection, who does not criticize vulnerability, and who genuinely wants to understand rather than control. The empath creates an environment where emotional honesty feels welcome. In that space, the avoidant may slowly begin to lower their guard. Conversations become more meaningful, moments feel more authentic. The connection begins to move beyond surface interactions into something more personal and emotionally rich. And that is where the complexity begins, because depth of connection is something the avoidant secretly desires, but has rarely allowed themselves to experience fully. The empath awakens a part of them that has long been dormant, the desire to be known, accepted, and emotionally supported. This desire is deeply human, yet for someone who has spent years protecting themselves from emotional closeness, it can feel overwhelming. As the empath continues to offer understanding and emotional presence, the avoidant may find themselves sharing thoughts and feelings they have never expressed before. They may open up about past disappointments, fears, or insecurities. These moments of openness can feel powerful because they represent a level of vulnerability that is unfamiliar to them. The empath does not force these moments. They simply make them possible. And that is precisely why the connection becomes so impactful. Unlike relationships built on convenience or attraction alone, the bond formed between an empathant and an avoidant often reaches a deeper emotional layer. It is not just about spending time together or enjoying each other's company. It is about feeling emotionally recognized. The avoidant senses that the empath understands them in ways others never have. But with that recognition comes a new challenge. The more deeply someone feels seen, the more exposed they can feel. For the avoidant, being understood can sometimes feel like standing without the protective shield they have relied on for years. The walls they carefully built around their emotions begin to weaken, and this can create a sense of internal conflict. Part of them appreciates the closeness, another part fears what that closeness might demand. Yet even in the midst of this tension, The avoidant cannot ignore the significance of the experience. The empath has shown them a level of emotional connection that is rare in their life. It is a reminder that relationships can offer understanding rather than pressure, compassion rather than expectation. And once someone experiences that kind of emotional depth, it leaves a lasting impression. The empath becomes associated with a feeling of being truly known, a feeling that many avoidants have quietly longed for but rarely encountered. That is why the connection between an empath and an avoidant often feels different from ordinary relationships. It touches something deeper within the avoidant's emotional world, something they may not fully understand but cannot easily forget. At the heart of many avoidant personalities lies a quiet contradiction. On the surface, they often appear independent, composed, and emotionally self-sufficient. They may pride themselves on not needing anyone too much. They keep their lives organized in a way that allows them to maintain control over their time, their space, and most importantly, their emotions. To the outside world, they may look like people who simply prefer freedom over attachment, but beneath that independence is a deeply human desire that never fully disappears, the desire to feel safe with someone. Avoidants do crave connection. They crave understanding, companionship, and emotional peace just like anyone else. The difference is that their past experiences have taught them that intimacy can come with risks they are not prepared to face again. Somewhere along the way, they learned that closeness could lead to disappointment, criticism, rejection, or the loss of personal autonomy. Those experiences shaped their beliefs about relationships, so they adapted. Instead of completely shutting down their ability to care, they developed strategies to protect themselves. They learned to keep relationships at a certain distance. They became skilled at enjoying connection without fully depending on it. They convinced themselves that emotional independence was safer than emotional vulnerability. Yet the need for emotional safety never disappears. Every person, no matter how guarded they may seem, wants to feel understood and accepted without feeling controlled or judged. For avoidants, this need is particularly complex. They want to feel close to someone, but they also fear the moment when that closeness might begin to demand more from them than they are comfortable giving. This is why their behavior can often seem confusing. At times, they may show warmth, affection, and genuine interest in someone. They may open up about personal thoughts or share meaningful moments that create a sense of connection. In those moments, they are experiencing the part of themselves that longs for emotional safety. They are allowing someone into their inner world, even if only briefly. But when the relationship begins to deepen, something inside them becomes uneasy. Intimacy has a way of revealing emotions they have worked hard to keep contained. The closer someone gets, the more visible their vulnerabilities become. They begin to worry that expectations will grow, that their independence might feel threatened, or that they might eventually be hurt if the connection fails. The fear is not always logical, and it is often not something they consciously analyze. It is more like an emotional alarm system that activates when the relationship starts to feel too significant, and so they retreat. His retreat does not necessarily mean they no longer care. In fact, it often happens precisely because they do care. The more meaningful the connection becomes, the stronger the internal conflict grows. Part of them wants to continue building the relationship, while another part is urging them to regain control by creating space. That is why avoidants sometimes pull away at moments when everything seemed to be going well. To the other person, it can feel sudden and confusing. One moment the connection feels genuine and promising, and the next moment the avoidant becomes distant or emotionally unavailable. But from the avoidant's perspective, this distance is a way of restoring the sense of safety they feel slipping away. They believe that by stepping back, they can regain emotional balance. Ironically, what they are truly seeking is the very thing they fear: emotional safety with another person. They want to feel close without feeling trapped. They want to share their world without losing control of it. They want someone who understands their pace rather than pushing them beyond it. When they meet someone who offers patience, empathy, and emotional steadiness, the experience can feel incredibly comforting. That person becomes associated with a sense of calm rather than pressure. Instead of feeling forced into vulnerability, the avoidant begins to feel that vulnerability might actually be safe. This is where the paradox becomes most visible. They crave the emotional refuge that a safe relationship can provide, yet they struggle with the vulnerability required to maintain that refuge. Their instincts push them in two directions at once, toward connection and away from it. And so their behavior becomes a cycle of approach and retreat, desire and distance, openness and protection. The avoidant is not running from love itself. They are running from the fear of what love might expose within them. Yet deep down, the longing for emotional safety continues to guide their heart, even when their actions suggest otherwise. One of the most powerful experiences for someone who has built emotional walls is the moment they realize another person can see beyond those walls. Avoidant individuals often become very skilled at presenting a controlled version of themselves to the world. They show the parts that feel safe to reveal: strength, independence, humor, intelligence, competence. These qualities allow them to interact comfortably with others while still protecting the deeper layers of their emotional life. Over time, this controlled presentation becomes almost automatic. They know how to keep conversations light. They know how to redirect attention away from their vulnerabilities. They know how to maintain just enough closeness to keep relationships functioning without allowing anyone to enter the spaces where their fears and insecurities live. Most people accept this version of them without question. But an empath tends to notice what others overlook. Empaths are naturally attuned to emotional subtleties. They pay attention not only to what someone says, but also to how they say it. They observe the pauses in conversation, the shifts in tone, the quiet moments when someone's expression reveals more than their words. Instead of taking things at face value, they sense the deeper emotional currents beneath the surface. When an empath interacts with an avoidant person, they often begin to recognize the difference between the outer personality and the inner emotional world. They sense that the confidence might sometimes mask uncertainty. They notice that the independence might sometimes hide a fear of relying on others. They feel the presence of emotions that the avoidant rarely expresses openly. What makes this dynamic powerful is that the empath does not approach these discoveries with judgment or pressure. Instead, they respond with curiosity and compassion. They might ask thoughtful questions that invite the avoidant to share more about themselves. They may gently acknowledge feelings that the avoidant has never voiced aloud. In doing so, they create an atmosphere where vulnerability feels less threatening. For someone who has spent years protecting their inner world, this experience can be both surprising and deeply moving. Suddenly, they are interacting with someone who seems to understand them without needing every detail explained. The empath senses when something is wrong, even when the avoidant insists they are fine. They recognize moments of emotional struggle behind a calm exterior. They notice the protective habits that others might mistake for indifference. This kind of recognition can feel incredibly validating. For the avoidant, it is rare to feel truly seen. Many people in their life may have respected their independence, but never attempted to understand the emotional reasons behind it. Others may have misunderstood their distance as lack of care. The empath, however, sees the humanity behind the defenses. They recognize the sensitivity that exists beneath the controlled exterior. They understand that emotional withdrawal often comes from past experiences rather than a lack of feeling. In that moment, the avoidant may begin to feel something unfamiliar, acceptance of the parts they usually hide. The empath is not impressed by the surface image alone. They are drawn to the deeper person beneath it. And when they respond with warmth rather than criticism, the avoidant begins to realize that their vulnerabilities may not be as dangerous to reveal as they once believed. This realization can be incredibly powerful because it challenges the beliefs the avoidant has carried for years. They may have believed that showing weakness would lead to rejection or disappointment. They may have learned that emotions should be managed privately rather than shared with others. But the empath offers a different experience. Instead of rejecting vulnerability, they welcome it. Instead of criticizing emotional complexity, they appreciate it. Instead of demanding perfection, they value authenticity. For the avoidant, this can create a sense of emotional relief. It feels like being understood in a way they never expected. They no longer need to maintain the same level of emotional distance because someone has shown them that their deeper self can be accepted. At the same time, this level of understanding can also feel intimidating. Being seen so clearly means the protective barriers they relied on are no longer fully effective. The empath's awareness gently exposes the fears and wounds the avoidant has spent years trying to keep hidden. This exposure is not harmful, but it can feel overwhelming because it challenges the safety of emotional invisibility. Yet, even with that discomfort, the impact of being truly understood leaves a lasting mark. When someone sees the real person behind the defenses and responds with compassion, it creates a powerful emotional memory. The avoidant realizes that someone was able to recognize their hidden struggles without turning away. And once a person experiences that level of recognition, it becomes difficult to forget the person who first saw them so clearly. When people with avoidant tendencies withdraw from a relationship, it can appear as if they have simply erased the emotional connection and moved on. Their ability to create distance can be so convincing that others assume the feelings must have disappeared as well. They may stop communicating, become emotionally unavailable, or shift their focus entirely toward work, hobbies, or personal independence. From the outside, it may look like the relationship meant very little to them, but emotional withdrawal does not erase emotional imprinting. Human connections leave traces in the mind and heart, especially when those connections involved authenticity, vulnerability, and moments of genuine understanding. The mind has a way of storing experiences that felt meaningful, even when someone tries to move away from them. For avoidant individuals, this emotional imprinting often happens more deeply than they realize at the time. During the relationship itself, they may focus on maintaining control over their emotions. When the connection begins to feel too intense or too demanding, their instinct is to create space. This instinct is not necessarily about rejecting the other person, it is about restoring a sense of internal balance. They step back so they can regain the emotional distance that helps them feel secure. However, once that distance is created, something unexpected often begins to happen. Without the immediate pressure of the relationship, the avoidant mind starts to revisit the experiences that took place within it. Memories surface quietly. Conversations that felt genuine, moments of laughter, the calm presence of someone who seemed to understand them. These memories are not always dramatic or intense. Often, they are simple moments that carried a sense of emotional comfort. Because the empath tends to create an environment of patience and understanding, the experiences shared with them can feel very different from other relationships the avoidant has known. Instead of feeling criticized or pressured, the avoidant may remember feeling accepted. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by expectations, they may recall moments where they could simply exist without needing to defend themselves. Those emotional experiences become imprinted in their memory. Psychologically, the brain is wired to remember experiences that carry emotional significance. When someone encounters a relationship that felt safe, authentic, or deeply understanding, the mind stores that experience as something valuable. Even if the avoidant tries to focus on moving forward, those memories can reappear in unexpected ways. A certain song may remind them of a conversation they once shared. A quiet evening may bring back the feeling of being emotionally understood. A challenge in life may make them recall the person who once offered support without judgment. These moments of recollection can create a subtle shift in how they view the relationship they left behind. Initially, their focus may have been on the aspects of the connection that triggered their fears. The growing intimacy, the vulnerability, the sense that the relationship was becoming too significant. But with time and distance, those fears begin to lose some of their intensity. What remains more clearly are the positive emotional experiences that accompanied the relationship. They begin to recognize that the person they withdrew from offered something meaningful. This realization does not always happen quickly. Avoidants often process emotions gradually because they are accustomed to keeping those emotions at a distance. They may not consciously analyze the connection right away. Instead, the understanding unfolds slowly through repeated moments of reflection. What they once ran from begins to appear in a different light. They realize that the emotional safety they experienced was rare. The sense of being understood was not something they encounter often. The person who offered that understanding becomes associated with a feeling of warmth and authenticity that stands out in their memory. Even if they do not immediately act on these realizations, the emotional imprint not remains present. It influences how they compare future relationships. It shapes their understanding of what meaningful connection feels like. It reminds them that someone once saw them beyond their defenses and responded with patience rather than judgment. Emotional withdrawal may create physical and emotional distance, but it does not erase the impact of genuine connection. The experiences shared with someone who truly understood them continue to live within their memory, quietly shaping how they think about relationships long after the distance was created. There are moments in relationships when everything begins to feel more real than either person expected. The conversations grow deeper, the connection becomes more meaningful, and the presence of the other person starts to carry emotional weight. For many people, this is the stage where a relationship begins to flourish. It feels exciting, comforting, and full of possibility. But for someone with avoidant tendencies, this stage can trigger an entirely different reaction. When love starts to feel real, it begins to touch parts of the avoidant's emotional world that they have spent years protecting. Avoidants often develop their emotional defenses early in life. At some point, they learn that relying too much on others could lead to disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. Because of that, they train themselves to maintain a certain level of independence in their relationships. They might enjoy connection, companionship, and even affection, but they usually feel safest when they know they can still maintain emotional distance. In the early stages of a relationship, this balance is easier to maintain. The connection feels light, natural, and manageable. There is curiosity, attraction, and excitement, but the emotional expectations are still relatively low. The avoidant can participate in the relatio, nip without feeling that their personal boundaries are being challenged. But as the relationship deepens, something begins to shift. When two people start sharing personal experiences, fears, dreams, and vulnerabilities, the bond between them becomes stronger. The relationship begins to move beyond casual interaction and toward genuine emotional intimacy. For the empath, this is often where their natural ability to connect deeply shines. They listen carefully, they show understanding, and they create a space where the other person feels emotionally supported. For the avoidant, however, this growing closeness can begin to feel overwhelming. The more real the connection becomes, the more they begin to recognize that the relationship could truly matter in their life, and that recognition introduces a level of emotional risk they are not used to facing. When love starts to feel genuine, it means the other person now has the potential to affect them deeply. This realization can trigger fear, not necessarily the fear of the other person themselves, but the fear of what emotional closeness might eventually lead to. The avoidant may begin to imagine scenarios where they lose their independence, where expectations grow beyond what they feel capable of giving, or where the relationship eventually ends and leaves them hurt. Even if none of those outcomes are actually happening, the mind of someone with avoidant tendencies can become focused on protecting itself from those possibilities. As a result, the moment when love begins to feel real can also become the moment when their instinct to retreat becomes strongest. They may start noticing small things that make the relationship feel too intense. They might interpret normal emotional needs as pressure. They may convince themselves that the relationship is moving too fast, or that they are not ready for such a deep connection. Sometimes they even begin to question whether their feelings are genuine. Not because the feelings disappeared, but because the intensity of those feelings feels unfamiliar. Running away becomes a way to regain emotional control. By creating distance, they reduce the vulnerability they were beginning to experience. They step back so they can return to the emotional independence that once made them feel safe. To the other person, this shift can feel sudden and confusing, especially when everything seemed to be going well. But the avoidance retreat is often less about rejecting love and more about managing the fear that love awakens. Real love requires openness. It requires allowing another person to see parts of you that are not perfectly guarded. For someone who has spent years protecting their emotional world, that level of openness can feel like stepping into unfamiliar territory. And when people feel unprepared for that kind of vulnerability, Their instinct is often to run back to what feels familiar. Yet even as they create distance, the experience of real connection does not disappear from their awareness. The depth they felt remains somewhere within them, reminding them that the relationship touched something genuine. That is why running away does not always bring the peace they expected, because a part of them knows they stepped away from something meaningful. For someone who has spent much of their life protecting their emotional independence, the idea of feeling at home with another person can feel both comforting and unfamiliar. Avoidant individuals often become accustomed to navigating life on their own terms. They rely on themselves for stability, decision-making, and emotional regulation. Over time, they build a life where their sense of safety comes from control over their environment, their time, and their emotional exposure. Because, say, of this, they rarely associate relationships with the feeling of true emotional rest. Many of their past experiences may have involved expectations that felt overwhelming or connections that demanded more vulnerability than they were ready to offer. As a result, relationships sometimes felt like something that required effort and caution rather than something that provided peace. They learned to keep a certain distance, not because they wanted to reject connection, but because distance allowed them to maintain balance. Then the empath enters their life and quietly changes that experience. An empath tends to bring a different energy into relationships. Instead of pushing for control or demanding constant reassurance, they create space for emotional honesty. Their presence is often calm, patient, and attentive. They listen without rushing to judge. They allow conversations to unfold naturally. They offer understanding without making someone feel exposed or pressured. For the avoidant, this type of presence can feel surprisingly comforting. In the company of an empath, they may begin to notice something unusual. Their guard does not need to be as strong as it once was. The empath is not trying to force them into emotional territory they are not ready to explore. Instead, they are simply present. They create an atmosphere where the avoidant can speak freely, remain silent when necessary, and express themselves without fear of being misunderstood. Gradually, this experience begins to feel like a kind of emotional home. An emotional home is not defined by grand gestures or dramatic expressions of love. It is defined by the quiet sense of safety that exists when someone feels accepted as they are. It is the comfort of knowing that you do not have to constantly protect yourself in someone's presence. It is the feeling that your thoughts and emotions can exist without being criticized or controlled. For many avoidants, this kind of emotional environment is rare. They may have encountered attraction, excitement, or companionship in previous relationships, but true emotional refuge is something different. The empath provides a space where they can breathe emotionally. They can share parts of themselves that they normally keep hidden. They can experience closeness without feeling that their independence is being taken away. This experience becomes deeply meaningful, even if the avoidant does not immediately express it. Because emotional homes are not easily replaced. When someone finds a place where they feel understood and emotionally safe, it creates a powerful association in their mind. That person becomes linked with a feeling of comfort that stands apart from ordinary interactions. It is not just about enjoying time together. It is about feeling emotionally settled in their presence. However, the very depth of that experience can also trigger the avoidance fears. Feeling at home with someone means acknowledging that the relationship matters. It means recognizing that the other person has become important in a way that challenges their long-standing commitment to emotional independence. For someone who has spent years relying only on themselves, that realization can feel unsettling. And so, at times, they may pull away in an attempt to regain their familiar sense of control. But distance often reveals something they did not fully appreciate before. When the empath's presence is no longer part of their daily life, the emotional calm they once experienced becomes noticeably absent. The conversations that once felt grounding are no longer there. The quiet understanding that made them feel accepted is suddenly missing. They may try to recreate that feeling with other people, but it rarely feels the same. Because our homes are not built on convenience. They are built on genuine connection. The empath created an environment where the avoidant could exist without defenses, and that experience leaves a lasting impression. Even if they step away for a time, the memory of that emotional refuge remains within them. It becomes a reference point for what true understanding felt like. And once someone has experienced the comfort of being emotionally at home with another person, it becomes difficult to forget the one who first made them feel that way. When someone is consistently present in our lives, it is easy to overlook the quiet impact they have on our emotional world. Their presence becomes familiar, almost routine, and we sometimes fail to fully recognize how much stability or comfort they bring. This is especially true for individuals with avoidant tendencies, who often focus more on maintaining their independence than on reflecting deeply about the emotional value of the people around them. While the relationship is active, the avoidant may still be navigating their internal fears about closeness. Even if the connection is healthy and meaningful, part of their mind may remain focused on protecting their sense of freedom. They might notice moments where the relationship feels intense or emotionally demanding, and those moments can overshadow the many ways the other person positively affects their life. Because of this, they may convince themselves that creating distance will make things easier. When they step away, they expect to regain a sense of relief. They imagine that once the emotional intensity fades, their life will return to a comfortable balance where they are no longer confronted with the vulnerability that the relationship required. Distance seems like a solution that restores their familiar independence. But distance often brings a kind of clarity that was not available while the relationship was unfolding. Once the empath is no longer part of their daily routine, the avoidant begins to notice the absence of things they once took for granted. The conversations that once brought emotional depth are gone. The moments of genuine understanding are no longer present. The subtle sense of calm that came from being around someone who accepted them fully is suddenly missing from their life. At first, these realizations may appear in small ways. A quiet evening might remind them of conversations they used to share. A personal challenge might make them think of the person who once listened without judgment. Situations that once felt easier to navigate with that person's support may now feel heavier. These moments of reflection slowly shift the avoidance perspective. When the relationship was close, their focus may have been on the fears associated with emotional intimacy. But with distance, those fears become less immediate. What begins to stand out instead are the positive experiences that defined the connection. They start remembering how patient the empath was during difficult conversations. They recall how safe it felt to express thoughts they normally kept hidden. The absence of those experiences creates a contrast that reveals their true value. Psychologically, human beings often understand the importance of something more clearly when it is no longer available. This does not mean the avoidant intentionally took the empath for granted. Rather, their internal defenses prevented them from fully appreciating the connection while they were still navigating their fears about it. Distance removes the emotional pressure they once felt, allowing them to reflect on the relationship from a calmer state of mind. In that calmer space, they begin to recognize that the empath's presence offered something rare. It was not just companionship or attraction. It was understanding. It was patience. It was the feeling that someone truly cared about their inner world without trying to control it. As this realization grows, the avoidant may begin to question the decision to withdraw. They might compare new interactions with the emotional depth they experienced before. Conversations with others may feel pleasant, but not as meaningful. Relationships that lack the empath's level of understanding may feel incomplete in ways they struggle to explain. Gradually, they come to see that the connection they stepped away from carried more significance than they initially allowed themselves to acknowledge. Distance, which once seemed like a solution, becomes the very thing that reveals what they lost. It highlights the difference between ordinary interaction and genuine emotional connection. It reminds them that the empath's presence brought a sense of authenticity and comfort that cannot easily be recreated. In this way, distance becomes a teacher. It shows the avoidant the true impact of the empath's presence by allowing them to feel the space that presence once filled. Through that realization, they begin to understand that some connections are not easily replaced, and the value of what they experienced becomes clearer with every moment of absence. Thank you for spending this time growing, reflecting, and investing in your emotional strength. Until we meet again, stay true to your heart and never forget the power of your worth.